All right, hey Fiberistas, welcome. It's Wednesday. I'm back from having a couple of weeks off, and I'm really glad you guys are here to join me. I'm Stacy Budge Camison with UrbanGypZ, and today I'm going to talk about my top 5 must-have yarns when it comes to freeform art weaving. Now let me back up for a minute. Okay, so I got an email from Diane, and she's had said that she was not a knitter or a crocheter, but had fallen in love with art weaving. And she wanted to know what kind of yarns would she need to get, or where could she find yarns that were good for art weaving. Now, I know a lot of you guys are like me and you've started art weaving and it was kind of born out of having a lot of knitting and crocheting stash. And so we've been able to kind of tap into that stash and use that for our art weaving. But what if you were starting from scratch? What if you had to go back and figure out what kind of yarn you needed? You're not really familiar with yarn overall, and you just needed to know where to get the yarn, what would be good for what, and so forth as far as art yarn. So that's where I'm kind of backing up. But at the same time, it might kind of give you a little information on fleshing out some of your stash. And you know what? I just lost my notes. Hold on. Here they are. Sorry about that. Okay, so excuse me. So let's start off. So I'm going to tell you 5 yarns, and there's more than 5 different yarns that you can have, but these are my must-haves as far as when it comes to where you just weave kind of willy-nilly and just go with inspirations in the moment. So these are 3 scarves that I kind of pulled to show for this demonstration. Anyway, and so if you have not done art weaving before, I have a video, a class series when you sign up for my newsletter, and I'll put a link in the show notes and below, where you can go and it's a series of lessons on how to get started making this kind of weaving. Okay, back to the yarn. So the number 1 yarn that I would get for art weaving is sock yarn. And by sock yarn, I mean fingering weight yarn. And I don't know if you guys can see, I'm going to hold this up. It's kind of a fingering weight yarn. And the fingering weight yarn is sock yarn typically has some kind of fiber in it that makes it strong. Okay, and here's another sock yarn. This is a spin cycle. I love this stuff. I've used this yarn for an entire wrap. This one is hedgehog fibers. I got it at one of my LYS, and this yarn has, let's see. This yarn has a little bit of nylon. And the reason why they have like either nylon or silk, or like this yarn, this is one that I dyed when I used to have a yarn business. And this is actually like a heavy fingering weight. And this one has sea cell fiber. So some kind of fiber, because wool by itself, depending on how it's spun, is not necessarily going to be as strong as if it has some kind of silk or nylon or sea cell or bamboo. That kind of tends to make the yarn a little sturdier. Now that's not to say, here's another yarn that I had dyed when I had a yarn business, but you can see how the twist in this yarn is tighter than the twist in this yarn. Here, let me hold them up next to each other. All right, so you can see how one is the twist is a little more bubbly, and whereas the twist seems a little longer on this one, and that's because this is a complete wool, but having that tighter twist makes the yarn a little stronger and good for socks. Okay, so the reason why sock yarn having that little bit of extra strength makes it really good for warp. And on all of these scarves, I've used primarily sock yarn as the warp for these. Now, like I said, it's the yarn tends to be thin enough to where you're going to get a good drape with scarves, and with that little bit of whatever's making it sturdy enough to knit socks out of, because socks get a lot of wear and tear. They're in your shoes, you're walking on it. Then that's going to be a really good yarn for the warp. It's going to give you some good strength. All right. Also, too, sock yarn. If you're not familiar with the knitting community, sock knitting and sock yarn is a whole subculture in and of itself. So you can get sock yarns in all kinds of, crazy colors, or even just some really good colors, just plain. You can get variegated. That's just a really good starting point. Sock yarns are, especially if you're getting sock yarns from hand dyers, sock yarns are a really good starting point for building your colorways out from that. So if you start with the sock yarn, then you can start to kind of add colors to kind of build your colorway from there. So sock yarn's a really good place to start. Now, granted, I have this. If you look at are looking at sock yarn, I would advise against getting a single ply yarn, and this is technically a sock yarn, but it's the single ply is just not as sturdy. It might hold up on your warp, but I would hate for you to warp your piece with a single ply sock yarn, and moving the heddle up and down and back and forth might fray a single ply a little faster than it would a sturdier yarn for a warp. So that's just a consideration. But like I said, this is perfectly fine for if you're using it for a weft. As a matter of fact, I use a lot of the single ply kind of yarns for my weft. But as far as if you're using it for warp, I would go with the sturdier ones, either really tightly plied wool or plied wool that has a blend of either like a bamboo, a silk, or a nylon. Anything like that's going to give it a little strength. And sock yarn, you can get a bunch of different colors. Now, places you can get sock yarn, of course, you can find it at your local yarn shops, or you can go to Etsy. There's tons of indie dyers on Etsy, or just check Ravelry. Ravelry, and I'll put a link of all of these in the show notes. Ravelry, if you're not familiar, is a knitting and crochet site. You might have to sign up for the free account, but from there you can find some indie dyers who are not necessarily on Ravelry, on Etsy, but have their own website. So you can just kind of surf around in sock knitting groups and just kind of figure it out from there. But otherwise, like I said, your local yarn shop, if you have one close to you, is a good place. If you have access to any fiber festivals, that's also an excellent place to find some indie dyed yarns. So I would start there to find sock yarns. All right. So the second yarn that I love is art yarn. And by art yarn, we're talking funky handspun. And I love the textures. These will pop out. Let me show you some of that here. Art yarn can give you some really great textures. Here's some good art yarn textures in this piece right here. It's a handspun that I got in New Mexico. I can't remember the woman's name. She was at the fiber festival that I went to. Here's a handspun. It gives a little bit of texture and interest right there. That's one that I did. And then this is a really funky handspun. Oh, can you see it? That has a lot of locks, and that's by Deborah Lambert. She's a hand spinner, and I'll put links to those resources. But this is a hand spun I did. Let's see what else. I've got this one I made with lots of locks. Now, and those are going to pop out some textures. You can do some really fun things with that. The place to get those is, again, Etsy, and I'll put a link in the show notes to how to search for that, as well as fiber festivals. Some yarn shops might carry handspun of local people, but maybe not. It might be a little harder. But if you can also try doing just a regular Google search. But usually your best bet is to go to Etsy, Again, you can also surf through Ravelry and see if you can find some hand spinners that are selling their work and get hand spun yarn there. Um, that's another great addition. You can do all kinds. Now this is actually hand spun here, but it's kind of a little on the plain side. And this is hand spun from Moon Rover, and I'll put a link to her shop. But she also, at that same skein, let me see if I can find it on the scarf. That same skein had these wonderful little bubbly pieces that fit right between the warps in this piece and adds this really cool texture. So, hand spun. Hand spun's another great thing. But if you don't have hand spun, another good way to add texture is with novelty yarns. And by novelty yarns, I mean we're talking like eyelash and funky boucle textures. And I get this eyelash stuff. I love this eyelash kind of thing. Whoop. Goodness, it's coming undone. All right, so eyelash is really good because it adds a little bit of dimension. You can see here I have a purple eyelash. Let's see if you can see right there. That adds just a little bit of something standing above the fabric. This stuff I get they used to have this stuff at yarn shops. But I tell you, the best place to get this stuff is actually at the big box craft stores like Michael's or AC Moore or Joann's. I think has them. Any place that sells yarn tends to have this kind of novelty yarn. But you have to kind of be careful because the colors aren't great. I mean, they're okay, but if you're using just like a strand, I wouldn't use a ton of it because then you'd have this furry scarf and it looks like Muppets. But otherwise, just a strand or two. I've even used it. You can see here. I've even used it. Here you can see I've used it as a warp because it's nylon, so it's going to be somewhat sturdy. But yeah, nylon. So I use just one strand, and that adds a little bit of dimension all down through. All right, novelty yarn. All right, the fourth must-have yarn that you can have for your weaving stash is actually not yarn at all. And what I mean is looking for things that you have around the house that you could use in your weaving. For example, this is a strip of sari silk ribbon. But who's to say that you couldn't tear a silk scarf and fray the edge? And this edge here, let me see if you can see that. That edge, when woven into your piece, is going to perform like an eyelash yarn and give a little bit dimension to your piece. You could also, let's see if I can find that scarf. This is pom-pom fringe. This is a craft pom-pom fringe that you can get at a fabric store. That's a really good, awesome thing to find to put into your weaving. You can also find this stuff like upholstery fringe is similar. You can find similar type upholstery fringe, or upholstery pom poms, or even loops, or little tassels. And you don't need much. You just need a little bit. So if you go to the fabric store, you can get like maybe a yard, half a yard, and that would be plenty for a couple of scarves even, because you wouldn't use that much. Other things you can use strips of leather. You can use, anything, netting, ribbons, raffia, anything goes. So a good place to kind of find that type of stuff is actually the thrift store. A lot of times, if you have a thrift store that has a section, I have one near me in the Raleigh-Durham area called the Scrap Exchange. I'll put a link in the show notes. And that place has a lot of that kind of stuff. It has sewing remnants that people cast off. There's a place, somebody who does leather production, so they have the stamped out parts of leather. You could cut up ties. That would be really cool. Strips of like fur. Like if you find upcycle a fur jacket from the thrift store, you could totally cut strips into that, or fake fur. That would be fun. You could do all kinds of stuff. So thinking outside of the box kind of adds a little bit of dimension, creativity. I'll tell you what, this right here, let me show you that. That part right here, this kind of lumpy thing, that is actually, that is a shawl I cast on and then messed up. It was a lace shawl, and so I just had this, just a few rows done, but I had already messed it up. And that's what this is. And rather than unraveling the yarn altogether, I just put that cast on bit in there, and it made it kind of like this loopy texture. So anyway, all right. And then the fifth yarn that I want to tell you that you must have in your stash is yarn you love. Straight up. I know a lot of people, knitters especially, when they go out of town, they'll go to yarn shops in the places where they go to visit, and they will buy a souvenir yarn, like a special yarn that they love, that they can that they can remember their trip by. And what's so wonderful about that is when you're doing this kind of weaving, you really don't, I mean, one skein yarn's going to last you for a while because you're not using a ton of it in your piece. So it's viable that you can find a really beautiful, luxurious, great color or great texture, or just something that just really catches your eye in the skein or in the ball, and you only need just one of those. I mean, you don't have to get, like, if you were knitting, you would have to get like a sweater's worth if you were making a project. But if you were just doing this kind of thing, one skein's going to do you. So when you're out and about and you see a place that has yarn, and you see something that just looks really cool that you can't take your eye off, then get it. Buy that yarn. Just buy one ball of it. That's all you need. Usually you can get, if it's not like a indie crafter or dyer, you can get a ball of yarn for pretty cheap. I think even a mid-range yarn, you can get a ball or two for anywhere from $6 to $12. But like even this is hand-dyed skein, and I love the color on this. I love the speckle dye. It's just that I think a little bit of this would be a great pop in a piece. And this skein cost me $30, but there's like 400 yards. Let me see. Is there yardage? Oh yeah. No, wait. I don't even see yardage on here. Sock yarn tends to run in this size skein about 400 yards. So that's going to get me quite a few scarves. So, I mean, don't be afraid to just, spend a little money on some yarn, because it's going to go, excuse me, it's going to go a long way in this kind of weaving. So that's the 5 that I have for you. But I wanted to talk about one more thing, because I know, Diane, you had specifically asked me about my cone yarns. And I'm going to put a link down below in the show notes on a couple of my favorite places to buy cone yarns. Cone yarns are specifically for weaving. And so it's usually finer, and it's usually a little sturdier than what you would use for weaving. I don't think it's a deal breaker if you can't find these or you don't get this for your weaving. I didn't have cone yarns when I started weaving. Well, I take that back. I did have some mill ends, but I wasn't using them in my weaving. My first weavings were literally all knitting yarns. But cone yarns, if you want to add, if you come across some that you like, or if you're doing a warp that needs to be really sturdy, as in when you do tapestry weaving, that yarn needs to be really sturdy, because you're really kind of tensioning against the pegs very tightly in a small space. So it's going to need to be tighter. Then yeah, you might want to go with some cotton cone yarns, and I'll put a link to my favorite places below. But this, I believe, is a mill end from that scrap exchange, and that's only because I live in North Carolina, and we have a large textile industry here. So a lot of times those textile factories will send off their remnant cones to to places like the Scrap Exchange, and it's pretty. I mean, this stuff is really fine. Let's see if you can see. I mean, that stuff is like tiny fine, but it's the type of yarn that they use to weave commercially woven cloth. So that's what I have for you. All right, I'm going to look at the comments. Kathy, hi Kathy, yay! It's great to be back. Hey Faith, hey Nikki. Nikki says, I love beehives in the handspun. So far, I can't perfect them, but I'm working on it. Oh, I know. I tell you, some people make the most, Moon Rover, she makes the most beautiful beehives that just look like little clouds. I love them. But yeah, those are wonderful. Deborah says, using found objects, doing wall hangings, and added old braided leather dog lead. Hey, I bet that looks really cool. Especially the old leather that has that wear to it. Ooh, girl, I bet that's beautiful, Deborah. If you're in the collective, put a picture of that in there. I think you are in the collective. Put a picture up in the Fiber Art Collective. I would love to see that. I bet that's gorgeous. But yeah, there you have it. I mean, you know, yarn that's not yarn, something found, and especially if it's an old dog lead that you've used, that has some sentimental value to it for sure. All right, so if I'm gonna hold on for a minute if anybody has any questions, and again, I'm gonna have tons of links in the show notes on these because I'm giving you a lot of resources for where I get my favorite stuff. Anyway, so if there aren't any questions, I'm going to sign off in a minute, but I'll give it a few minutes to see. And it looks like that's it. All right, but if you have any other questions, then by all means hit me up in the comments below and I'll answer them, or in the Fiber Art Collective, or just shoot me an email. Shoot me an email and I will answer your question. And if it's a wonderful question like Diane's question, it might even become a live cast like this one. We'll do currently juried show in Pennsylvania. Fantastic. All right. Juried show. I bet it looks awesome. I know it does. Okay. All right. So if that's it, I'm going to sign off and I will see you guys next week. Bye.